So I know this is very old news by now, but today I've been reading this essay put out by JK Rowling about transgender people and the trans rights movement, and I've been going through it, and I'm just sort of trying to pick up on like the various sort of points that she's been making in that article and the supposed dangers of this movement and where it's likely to lead. And she's been publicly pilloried, obviously, for her views, and I don't know, cancelled off Twitter or something like that, or maybe not. I can't even remember. But yeah, she's been making a few troubling points in this piece of writing, this essay on her website, that I have trouble with, I think, and that most people, I think, in the trans movement will probably have problems with. She's making the sort of faintly paranoid, I think, point that sexual predators among men are now liable to go dressed up as women and go into female changing rooms and toilets and things like this, and, like, I don't know, spy on them or sexually assault them or something like that. And well, I mean, that's the problem of Peeping Toms, isn't it? And that's something I'm afraid to say that, yeah, a certain class of men, the perverted class of men, will engage in from time to time, it seems, but I've never heard of one taking the trouble to actually dress up as a woman, as camouflage, to go about peeping in the girls' changing rooms, this sort of thing. I've never heard of that happening. And, like, frankly, any changes to the laws surrounding transgenderism or trans rights, I don't think is likely to increase or decrease the dangers associated with peeping toms, if you know what I mean. I don't think it's going to make, like, any, like, say it happens in a shopping centre or something, a shopping centre toilet, just for example. You know, we've got cameras in there. Like, the fact that they're dressed as a woman isn't going to make them any more likely to be able to get away with that crime, I don't think. You know, it's, and, you know, probably the fact we have CCTV now, that's really, because, yeah, a peeping Tom, that's, in my mind anyway, that's kind of an old-fashioned idea, isn't it? But then again, I have no idea how often it goes on. It might go on all the time, still. I don't know, really. But, yeah, and I think when it comes to safety measures on that level, like, it's more like CCTV and the introduction of that that's probably brought that sort of crime down over the years. So yeah, I mean, that's a one faintly paranoid argument I think that she's making, and then she's alluding to a notion that in order to identify as women, trans women, they ought to have the hormones and the surgery, and I find that frankly rather offensive. I think that's yeah, a faintly evil idea that that oh, you ought to have your genitals taken off you before you may identify as a woman. I think it's an execrable, nasty suggestion. And, you know, we've got some great figures in the trans community who, as I understand it, don't take the hormones, don't consider the surgeries. Eddie Izzard is probably the major example of that sort of person. I'd be one of those sorts of people as well. I identify as bigender, so I want to acknowledge my own femininity while also retaining aspects of my masculine identity also. So, and yeah, within, like, the sphere of gender identity, and this is something that, you know, the likes of Piers Morgan and these other sort of frankly reactionary figures on the right will go, you know, no end towards sort of trying to lambast and saying, oh, it's just too confusing, there's all these, like, 100 gender identities that we've got to now know the names of, and like, yeah, it is good to have a broad spectrum of different gender categories. I think it allows people to be, you know, it gives people a chance to have acuity in terms of how they identify and how they feel about themselves. And, you know, if you want to go looking up the 100 gender identities or whatever it is now, yeah, it is just a Google search away, for goodness sake. And there's the more traditional ones, like trans man, trans woman, and then there's things like bigender or gender fluid or gender neutral, and all these other categories. And ultimately, they're not that hard to memorize, really. I mean, there's two spirits, which sounds a bit silly, I grant you, but that derives from, as I understand it, Native American religion, and so people within Native American societies would be identified as two spirits, and yeah, as sort of gender non-conforming on a level also as a result of being two spirit, and were like valued members of the spiritual life of communities in Native American culture. So that's sort of where that comes from, I think. And then she's talking about how trans rights activists are attempting to erode traditional categories of sex and or replace categories of biological sex with gender. And this is something that's, this is one of the classic objections by the right, frankly, against these activist movements. Like, it's actually not the trans rights activists themselves beginning to reappraise biological sex and gender. This is something that is going on this is an active area of research in biology now. Biologists are starting to reappraise biological sex. I've been reading a very good article in Scientific American from 2015, under the biology category, obviously, entitled Sex Redefined. The idea of two sexes is overly simplistic. And yeah, it turns out it is overly simplistic. I've been reading about a woman who seems to have inherited both X chromosomes and XY chromosomes, because her body would have been formed from the merging of two embryos within the womb. And it sounds very science fiction-y. Yeah, she has something called, what is it called again? It's called a DSD. Yeah, disorders of sex development. And it's speculated that as many as 1 person in 100 has some form of DSD. And we know also from our interactions with men and women that there are very clear subunits and differences within a given biological sex class or gender, whichever you want to call it. Some men produce a lot more testosterone than other men. That is just clear. We know that. And on a level, like, everyone's balance of hormones and hormone production will be different. I mean, my hormonal... I'm not one of these, testosterone raging guys, and I never have been. And, the smallest kid at school, not sporty. At primary school, I actually, instead of playing rugby, I played netball with the girls. And had a lovely time, actually, doing that. But, yeah, and then at secondary school, I was forced to play rugby, and I played rugby badly. And I was never, going to be one of these jock, uber testosterone-filled, manly guys. And, eventually after much trouble in my life, much trouble with issues of sexual orientation, and eventually focusing on gender identity, which in that whole maelstrom and mix and confusion in my teenage years, I sort of neglected, and I sort of hadn't really thought about gender identity at all. I just thought, well, I'm male, I'm just going to stick with that. But then within the category of maleness, there's such diversity anyway. There's it's a huge spectrum where people can end up finding themselves within their own unique hormonal register, and on top of these natal sexual differences, or these natal differences in hormones, we find very likely epigenetic factors playing into it along the way. and it's very, very complicated. And you know, JK Rowling, yeah, she's like, what? Like, is she a biologist? Is she a scientist? No, she isn't. Like, how far does her knowledge of biology extend? I mean, I don't know if she did it for A level or not, but I'm gonna like, I'll go on a limb and say that it probably doesn't extend much further than when she was taking her O levels or GCSEs back in the 1980s or whenever it was, and the field has moved on considerably since then. And I suspect, given the essay that she'd written, that she is yet a bit out of touch when it comes to the actual science there and the research, and not merely what the trans activist lobby are saying. And yeah, the trans activist lobby, they are further ahead with the science than she is, it seems. And you know, then you got like the likes of Jordan Peterson on a similar, coming from a similar sort of angle with it all, you know, like lambasting the relatively new fields such as gender studies and all this sort of thing, which seems to have marked itself out some territory in academia, and this sort of is pissing him off a bit for some reason. And you know, you got, like, at one point Jordan Peterson ought to have probably realised that psychology was an emerging field of human endeavour, and probably, yeah, sneered at and lambasted by the stuffy old professors of yesteryear. And yeah, just like tone it down and just be like, accept it. But do I advocate the amount of palpable hatred that JK Rowling has received as a result of the things that she's been saying on Twitter? I mean, if she's saying anything on Twitter, frankly, I don't think people should say things on Twitter and expect to have nuanced, rational arguments on there. And she is right about that. It is anathema to being able to have that happen. But yeah, like, and maybe she is just doing it for attention also. There's that possibility. That she's got, I don't know, some sort of book to flog, and what I understand about her new Robert Galbraith books, where it was a pretty transparent thing. She's trying to, like, see if she, as a man, could sell more books than what her as JK Rowling with Harry Potter. I think that's been a conspicuous failure, hasn't it? And her new books aren't considered very good, and she may just be trying to drum up a bit of publicity for publicity's sake, I think. Then there's also the issue that, yeah, she's an older person, and you know, you have this classic drifting to the right of people who are like liberal and progressive in their younger years. That's a very well documented phenomenon, I think, and a general sort of growing out of touch with it all. But yeah, I don't endorse like the abuse she's been getting online over all this. And like, really, what's the appropriate reaction when someone like JK Rowling comes out with a sort of slightly out of touch, slightly paranoid, slightly fusty, frankly, bit of writing about trans rights, which is, by the way, as she, I don't believe she is a trans person herself. Why does she have a dog in the fight at all? And it's like, as a, she's got some sort of feminist position about it, and it's like, well, like, well, yeah, like, maybe not a radical feminist, but you seem to be a trans exclusionary feminist. And yeah, like, on that level, the activists do have a point. But really, these sorts of people should just be ignored. You know, they shouldn't be cancelled. They shouldn't be lambasted on the internet. And the internet makes it all too easy just to have this knee-jerk reaction of sending something horrible to her in response to something she's written, because you've got that like veil of anonymity if you so choose to have that. And yeah, it's like, what usually would happen in, like, I think days gone by when it comes to this sort of thing, and people coming out, firstly, it would be a lot more difficult in the past to actually put these ideas out there in the public sphere. But you know, usually when you get the old reactionary type, people just go, oh, like, oh, another one, is like, alright, and ignore them. And that's usually more like the attitude there, I think. But yeah, like as I said, old news. There's far more important things going on in the world at the moment. Yeah, than all this really. But yeah, it's just it's sad to sort of dig into it a little bit more and find out that someone who I admired greatly growing up, really, you know, she was the literary hero of our generation, really, the great you know and venerable author that who produced a cultural landmark for people of my generation. And I'm first generation Harry Potter, by the way, born 1993, read Philosopher's Stone when I was 8 or 9, I think. So yeah, first generation Potter. Oh yeah. And it's a bit sad to see them coming out with all this guff at the moment, and it is guff mostly, and silly nonsense. And she should, yeah, hate to invoke a sort of trope here, but educate herself a bit more, and yeah, like, and maybe leave Twitter alone a bit more, and just keep the silly tweets after that, third glass of wine, is it? Just to, a minimum, let's say. Thank you everyone for watching. Bye bye. I love you lots.